They use deposits to make loans to you and me to buy our houses, to buy our cars. But without some kind of securitization mechanism, that means that the banks are hold
all of that in our video library at cspan.org and Washington Journal Live at 7 a.m. Eastern every day. We're taking you live next to the U.S. House. 5 bills on the agenda, including one dealing with gaming activities in Arizona on Indian lands. Later this evening, a moment of silence in the U.S. House for the victims of the Navy Yard shooting. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1410.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 154, H.R. 1410, a bill to prohibit gaming activities on certain Indian lands in Arizona until the expiration of certain gaming compacts.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, pardon me, but each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to review and extend their remarks and to include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
H.R. 1410, the Keep the Promises Act, introduced by a bipartisan group of members from the Arizona delegation, would preserve Arizona voters' approved gaming compact by prohibiting any Indian casino on land acquired in trust after April 9, 2013 in the Phoenix metropolitan area. This prohibition would expire on January 1, 2027, when the current gaming compact negotiated with the Arizona governor expires. This bill helps to resolve public promises that were supposedly made in good faith to the voters of Arizona. In 2002, the voters supported the passage of Proposition 202, which limited the number of tribally owned casinos in the state, and it granted tribes exclusive rights to operate casinos in Arizona. During the Proposition 202 campaign, a public promise was made by a coalition of 17 Arizona tribes, including the Tohono O'odham Nation, to limit casino gaming in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Unfortunately, it appears that a tribe is on the verge of breaking that commitment, and more than a majority of the tribes in the state are upset. The immediate effect of the bill is to block the Tohono O'odham Nation from opening an off-reservation casino in the Phoenix area. This is a modified version of a bill passed by an overwhelming majority of the House last year. As mentioned earlier, the bill has bipartisan support, including a majority of the House delegation, the governor of Arizona, and 6 of the tribes that took part in Proposition 202 agreement: the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, the Gila River Indian Community, the Wallapai Tribe, the Pueblo Zuni, the Cohopa Indian Tribe, and the Fort McDonald Yavapai Tribe. It is important to point out that it is not just Arizona tribes that support this bill. I have met tribes from other states, and they are very concerned about what is happening in Arizona. They believe that if our legislation is not signed into law, a dangerous precedent could be set, leading to the expansion of off-reservation casinos in Arizona and other states. They want to see Congress protect state gaming compacts. For me, today's deliberations are not about stopping one casino or gaming as a whole. I support gaming. The Keep the Promises Act is about protecting the integrity of my state's gaming compact, the future of gaming in Arizona, and ultimately the future of Indian gaming in this country. I urge adoption of the measure and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're back again. This is the second different piece of legislation, and quite honestly, H.R. 410 is nothing more than a special interest legislation designed to protect the Phoenix market from a few wealthy tribal gaming enterprises. The legislation not only upsets settled law, potentially subjecting the United States to new liabilities for breach of trust, breach of contract, and taking claims valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But it also creates a dangerous precedent for hundreds of tribal state compacts, land and water rights settlements that are found nationwide. Let's talk about those promises. The Gila Bend Act, approved and enacted by Congress 25 years ago, entitled the Tohono O'odham Nation to acquire non-reservation land anywhere within 3 Arizona counties in order to replace original reservation land rendered economically useless by the Painted Rock Dam, the San Lucie district in particular, which that community was totally destroyed. The settlement specifically promised that the nation could acquire new replacement land that could be used for the nation for economic development and as a federal reservation for all purposes. H.R. 410 would impose additional restrictions beyond those agreed upon by the United States and the O'odham Nation 25 years ago, breaking the solemn promise made between 2 sovereign nations. This would mark the first and only time in modern era in which the United States unilaterally reneges on a tribal land and water rights settlement. Last time around, the special interest behind this legislation tried to amend the actual settlement language from 1986. They soon discovered that that would open up a Pandora's box, potentially rendering more than a century's worth of binding legal agreements with Native American tribes and nations, and it would render it moot. This time, they thought they would be clever and instead attack the actual state compact. But this legislation sets equally dangerous precedents. In 2003, the state explicitly agreed that the nation could conduct gaming on any of the nation's lands that meet the requirements of IGRA. Proposition 202, the voter-sanctioned state law, which gave the governor the authority to enter into the very tribal gaming compact now in force, includes the exact same language allowing the nation, the O'odham Nation, to conduct gaming on lands that meet the requirements of IGRA. H.R. 410 breaks this contractual promise that Arizona made to the O'odham Nation. It would also be the first and only time the United States unilaterally inserts new terms into a tribal state gaming compact. Let me restate that. H.R. 410, the federal government will be stepping in and unilaterally altering a voter-approved, legislatively approved, tribal-approved, and governor-approved binding tribal state compact. How's that for a dangerous precedent? This legislation would put all tribal gaming compacts at risk, a collateral attack by members of Congress. Now, the special interests are bringing 410 up, this time because they have lost yet another court case. Since its predecessor, H.R. 2938, was introduced in 2011, almost every argument to justify H.R. 2938 and now H.R. 1410 have been rejected by federal courts in multiple cases. In fact, there have been 11 administrative and judicial decisions rejecting justifications for this legislation. The latest came June 25, 2013, when the Federal District Court ruled that Arizona's tribal gaming compact was fully integrated and contained no prohibition, I repeat, no prohibition of new gaming in Phoenix. This foreclosed any alleged promises not to game. The court dismissed all remaining claims by the plaintiffs. Aside from making good on what the federal government promised the O'odham Nation, this is also about jobs. Jobs that project to create 9,000 and $300 million in annual economic impacts. This is critical to the economic well-being of the West Valley of Phoenix and the state of Arizona. This is why many surrounding cities and hundreds of business leaders and trade organizations are supportive of the project. The city of Glendale, where the casino will be located and which was initially party to the lawsuits, is now actively working with the nation to move forward on the project. They see the economic benefits it will bring. In fact, they are asking Congress not to pass this legislation, as it will only undermine their ongoing talks. Congress needs to stop interfering in this issue in the order of picking winners and losers. This bill is just a waste of time and energy, and that this Congress should be spending on many more pressing issues that face this nation. It should be noted that the administration has twice testified against this bill in both versions, which, regardless of what happens today in the House, it will not become law. With that, I reserve the balance of my time and yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves. Excuse me, the gentleman from Arizona.
Reserve. I reserve my time.
Gentleman
I reserve the
reserves.
balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Secretary.
I'm directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman, the author of this bill, Mr. Trent Franks.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thank the gentleman. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I begin, might I just, on behalf of a lot of the members here of the House of Representatives, thank Peggy Sampson for her tremendous work to help us all. This is her birthday, Mr. Speaker, and we wish her a happy birthday. Hope she has 100 more, and that at least 90 of them are spent helping us here in this House to do a better job, and we appreciate her very much. With that, Mr. Speaker, let me also thank Chairman Hastings and leadership for bringing this bill to the floor today, as well as the bipartisan group of co-sponsors for their support. I certainly want to thank all of the Arizona delegation that are members they're members of the delegation that are in support of this bill. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1410, the Keep the Promise Act, seeks to prevent Las Vegas-style gaming in the Phoenix metropolitan area until the gaming compact that both the tribes agreed to and the Arizona voters approved expires in 2027. One Tucson area tribe is trying to build a major casino on lands that were purchased in the Phoenix metropolitan area at the very same time that they were in negotiations with other tribes in the state to craft this gaming compact. These actions are contrary to the public commitments that this particular tribe made between 2000 and 2002 to the 16 other Indian tribes in Arizona, the state itself, and the voters of the state of Arizona. And they publicly supported the passage of Proposition 202, a state referendum to limit casino gambling in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Mr. Speaker, the bipartisan co-sponsors of H.R. 1410 are simply trying to keep all of the parties to their publicly stated commitment to the people of Arizona, not to engage in gaming in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Mr. Speaker, during the subcommittee hearing on this bill, witnesses made clear that there is a problem and that a serious threat to the negotiated gaming structure in Arizona will ensue if this tribe is able to break its promise and develop a Las Vegas-style casino in the Phoenix metropolitan area. H.R. 1410 prevents an onerous precedent that could lead to an out-of-control expansion of off-reservation casinos, as well as dangerous changes to the complexion of tribal gaming in other states across America. Mr. Speaker, tribes across this nation, including many of the other Arizona tribes that played an integral role in the 2002 Gaming Compact, strongly support this legislation due to the impact this situation could have on tribal gaming enterprises nationally. The bill is also supported by the state of Arizona, the city of Glendale, the city of Litchfield Park, the city of Scottsdale, the city of Tempe, the town of Gilbert, and the editorial board of the Arizona Republic, which is the largest newspaper in the state. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, even if the casino weren't in violation of federal law or contrary to the voter-approved gaming compact, claims that the operation would create jobs and benefit the economy of the surrounding area are woefully misinformed at best and shamefully dishonest at worst. Tellingly, multiple organizations, including the city of Glendale, asked that the tribe release the data and methodology supporting their economic study, which was conducted roughly 4 years ago, Mr. Speaker, and to this day the tribe continuously, steadfastly refuses. In other words, the tribe released a batch of numbers extolling the supposed amazing economic benefits of this new casino and then refused to tell anyone how they came about finding and coming up with those numbers. Mr. Speaker, this bill does not impact any tribe's ability to have lands taken into trust, nor does it impact any water or land claims. Consistent with the intent of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and Proposition 202, This bill merely restricts the ability of tribes to gain on the very lands on which they agreed that they would not gain. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I respectfully ask that my colleagues join me and the members of Arizona's delegation in supporting this bill, and I respectfully yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the
Gentleman
balance.
yields back.
I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me enter into the record 3 letters. One from Councilwoman Norma Alvarez from the city of Glendale, and let me quote from her. As a member of the Glendale City Council, I urge you to oppose H.R. 1410, the so-called Keep the Promise Act. This bill is aimed at halting the Tohono O'odham Nation's resort and casino project in the West Valley in order to preserve the market share for 2 wealthy tribes on the other side of the valley. In serving these narrow interests, H.R. 1410 will also be harmful to my constituents who want the thousands of jobs that the West Valley Resort and Casino will create. I am part of a majority of the Glendale City Council that supports beginning discussions with the O'odham Nation to find ways to work together. These talks are long overdue, and they need an opportunity to succeed. Councilman from Glendale, Samuel Chavarria. Let me quote from him. As an elected official, I believe this legislation is not only detrimental to my community, but is an affront to the notion of fairness in attempting to overturn a land settlement resolved by Congress 3 decades ago, brought by parties who have repeatedly failed to sustain their position in court. My constituents want this project to go forward. The sooner the better. Please join me in opposing H.R. 1410. Ian Hugh, Councilman, City of Glendale. There is now a consensus of the Glendale City Council that favors pursuing discussion with the Tohono O'odham Nation about the project, which represents our first opportunity in years to work together constructively. Passing H.R. 1410 at this moment would undercut the very local communities it's supposed to protect. I ask you to please oppose this bill and oppose any effort to move H.R. 1410 until after the decisions between the city and the tribe run its course. I also want to have one additional communication to enter. It's the Glendale grassroots Tea Party activists, and let me quote from their communications to Congress. I feel confident that I speak for the majority of those involved with the Gila River action in Glendale, as well as other Tea Party organizations in the West Valley, that we can all be in agreement that to continue on this insane spending, egotistical stubbornness, and the refusal to sit down in a professional-like manner and talk regarding this issue will eventually be the death trap financially of the city and the state and hurt many innocent families in keeping good-paying jobs here within reach. I am sending each of you a copy of this letter, as well as posting it on all our Facebook web pages of many of the legislative districts. Tea Party organizations, Republicans coalitions, and various other organizations to ensure that there is a peaceful resolution and in opposition to H.R. 1410. With that, I yield back and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire to the amount of time remaining?
13 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
How much do I have?
Mr. Speaker, and Congressman Gosar, thank you. And from all of us, Peggy slipped off the floor. Happy birthday. Mr. Speaker, I actually come here before the mic, I think actually with somewhat of a unique perspective on what's going on here. And I hate to admit I'm getting this old, but in 1993, I was the majority whip in the Arizona State House. I was the one who was assigned to work as a negotiator on the original IGRA compacts between the state of Arizona, the legislature had to put its package together, and the tribal communities, our 21 land-holding tribes within the state of Arizona. So I spent a year of my life with lawyers and tribal members and their lawyers and members of the legislature and members with the governor's office going over this over and over and over. And the concern that constantly came up was if we make this deal, as IGRA that had passed a few years earlier and was sponsored by one of our U.S. senators, are we confident that this very situation that's happening right now would not happen? And look, I know many of the players have changed in those 20 years, but this is what we talked about. And now I need to take you to the next reason. Why is this so dangerous to our state? Arizona does something, and I don't know if it's unique to our state, but there's the ability for my poor rural tribal communities to transfer their machines to urban communities. I believe if this casino goes into my metropolitan area, my state within a couple of years becomes a full-scale gaming state, because the horse track and the others are already lining up, gearing up, I believe, to do the initiative saying, hey, what we all thought we had this deal, look what's happening. They're coming into your neighborhoods. Let's just put it on the ballot and let everyone participate in full-scale gaming. And the moment that happens, the value of the machine transfer for these poor rural tribes that are just now starting to build that consistent cash flow will go away. This is much more than just dealing with the Tohono O'odham and where their aboriginal lands are and this acquisition of lands that are 100 miles beyond. This is an issue of, are you about to allow something to happen that will change the very nature of my state? With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves.
Thank you,
The chair
Mr.
recognizes Mr. gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you very much, Speaker. It's hard to, it's impossible. It's been impossible to correct the misrepresentations and to put that mildly. The constant and sophisticated disinformation lobbying campaign has persisted without regard to facts or reality. And there's been some constant points that were made that 1410 is about stopping reservation shopping and off-reservation gaming, akin to the situation that's going on in Michigan. It's totally different, it's unrelated, and the decree by Congress in law, upheld by state and federal law, points to the fact that that is not real and it is totally different. That the 202 initiative that the public voted on and passed, that somehow is in jeopardy. The last court hearing reaffirmed that that was not the case, and that it is a precedent for all state compacts to be opened up. Each state compact is unique, different, with its own checks and balances, and Arizona is no different. And this is a violation of the state gaming compact, that there was a gentleman's agreement. Again, the courts pointed that that was not, in fact, part of the record or part of the decision. And that court decisions, 410, very interesting, court decisions, Interior Department findings are of no matter. That 2009, April 30th, Department of Interior ruled in favor of the O'odham Nation. 2009, June, ruled in favor of the O'odham Nation. 2010, July, EcoHawks Trust decision letter in favor of the O'odham Nation. The Gila River versus the U.S., 2011, March, court summary judgment in favor of the Autumn Nation. 2013, May, Ninth Circuit Court decision in favor of the Autumn Nation. The Autumn Nation versus Glendale on an annexation issue. 2011, May, Court of Appeals decision, Autumn Nation. 2011, October, Supreme Court denial of petition for review, Autumn Nation prevails. 2011, December, Supreme Court fee award, Autumn Nation prevails. 2012, January, Superior Court judgment, Autumn Nation prevails. Autumn Nation versus Arizona. 2011, June, District Court's summary judgment, Autumn Nation prevails. 2011, June, again, District Court judgment, Autumn Nation. Arizona versus Autumn Nation. District Court order on a motion to dismiss, again, claims 1, 2, and 3, and 7 in part, Autumn Nation wins. 2013, May, District Court summary judgment order, all remaining claims except breach of contract under restatement, Autumn Nation wins. 2013, June, Court summary judgment, all remaining claims including breach of contract, Autumn Nation prevails. Again, June 2013, District Court judgment, Autumn Nation prevails. 11 in total, administrative and judicial decisions. But let's not let facts and judicial precedent and the fact that the Autumn Nation has prevailed consistently against the state, against the city of Glendale, against the competing tribes, over and over again, and has had the Interior Department, which I, as stated earlier, has testified twice against the previous legislation and this legislation, that against it. I want to quote from the Glendale Star, from their editorial of August 1st. Is it any wonder so many people distrust government at any level when there are so many questions about the motive of the plaintiffs that are suing the Autumn Nation? One begins to ask about the greed factor. Does anyone believe the future of Indian gaming in Arizona is at risk if the Autumn Nation eventually wins a long, drawn-out battle in the court? Who is willing to bet on the future of Indian gaming in this state? If the congressman who is sponsoring this legislation is so set against gaming, he should be trying to get rid of all casinos in the state. He should be out stumping for the end of gaming altogether instead of working on the side of two major gaming operations in the valley, both in the East Valley, by the way, and not the West Valley. This Congress needs to start looking in his own backyard and trying to come up with solutions to unemployment, help for small business owners, transportation gridlock, and more than blocking what could be a big step toward economic stability, i.e. jobs. At least the nation's resort casino would provide construction jobs for many out-of-work carpenters and masonry workers for a year or two. Those jobs are needed now. I mention all this because, as I said earlier, it's been difficult to try to counter the allegations and the misrepresentations and the disinformation that have been leveled against the Autumn Nation's efforts to establish a casino under a congressional decision and law that afforded them to make them whole because of the land they lost because of the dam. And we're still back here on this particular piece of legislation. So court decisions, administrative decisions matter not. Precedent matters not. The opening of Pandora's box in terms of water claims and other settlements with Indian country matters not. What matters is to protect some very important gaming interests and special interests for two gaming entities that have had the luxury for the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. Autumn Nation has prevailed in court. The issue of a backroom deal that wasn't kept has been ruled moot by the court. The issue that this is somehow reservation shopping and off-site gaming has been ruled moot by the court. And then you have the Glendale City Council, a principal plaintiff in this, now retreating and rather working with the O'odham Nation to work out some agreements as opposed to continuing the litigation. The courts have ruled $4.5 million is owed to the tribe in legal costs by both the state and the affected gaming entity, also from Glendale. And I think it's time that as this legislation goes forward, that people ask a very fundamental question about this legislation. Is it intended to preserve a gaming compact, which I believe and the court has ruled no, or is it intending to preserve a market share for two gaming entities that have enjoyed that market share by themselves? The free market requires competition. The free market requires opportunity, and all that is happening in this legislation is to try to constrict the ability of people in this free market of ours to compete, to create jobs, and to create opportunities. With that, I yield back and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back and reserves. The gentleman, or the chair, recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge that out of our committee, this bill was reported 35-1 in favor of this bill, so a heavily bipartisan bill reported to the House, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves.
Oh, there's no question that the prevailing point of view, and I talked about the disinformation, will prevail here today. I have no question about that. Does the fact that we are going against judicial decisions, undoing a law that was passed by this Congress to make whole a tribe who lost their land 25 years ago, and interjecting ourselves for the first time in the history of this nation into a state and Native American gaming compact, that doesn't negate that. So, you know, my opposition, whether it's in the distinct minority or not, is based on what I believe is reality and fact. And if this debate was about reality and fact and not about supposition, disinformation, or misinformation, the debate would be in a whole different tone. This is about economic development for the state. This is about Congress making true on a decision it made 25 years ago. And this is about Congress not shortcutting judicial decisions that have been made over the course of the last 5 years, in which the O'odham Nation has prevailed in every one of them. So, given all that, bipartisanship, I love it, but being correct and holding true to a decision that this Congress made 25 years ago, I think is consistent with the work of this House and consistent with preserving gaming compacts in states and, more importantly, making whole a tribe that lost valuable resources to the federal government in the past. With that, I yield back and reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
The chair recognizes the gentleman for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for yielding some time to me. I rise in support today of H.R. 1410. The Saginaw Chippewa tribe in Michigan, whom I have the privilege of representing here, and for reasons that I concur with, have asked that I support this legislation, along with several other Michigan tribes that are opposed to off-reservation gaming. And so I ask my colleagues to join me in support of this legislation and in opposition to off-reservation gaming. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Chair
Thank you very much. And in closing, let me say that the situation in Michigan, as I mentioned, is unrelated to this. There is no legal precedent, and there is no congressional action to guide the decisions of courts, which has been the case with the O'odham decision and with the casino in the West Valley. Let me just say, this is about fairness. This is about Congress upholding its word. This is not about reservation shopping. It's not about off-site gaming. It is not about a gentleman's agreement, and it is totally and entirely about an act that was taken 25 years ago, upholding that act, making a tribe hold, and not opening up a Pandora's box in which litigation will continue to proceed once this legislation goes forward. With that, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Trust is a series of promises kept. That's the basis of all government functions. And that is the same thing that is required of the To'o O'odham. When they entered into the agreement in 2002, they publicly supported the compact in which limited the amount of casinos in the greater Phoenix area. Yes, it is true there are other precedents behind it, but contractual law always follows and subjugates itself when you look at this. The speaker from Arizona spoke about the dialogue with the courts. The courts had to rule because the To'o O'odham hid behind sovereignty, in which the tapes and discussion, in which they were truly negating or negotiating behind closed doors in dire dissent against this compact, would not be disclosed. So the court only had one way to look. Congress has the ability to rectify this answer, and that's why we are here today. This is good legislation. It doesn't prohibit any of the jurisdictions over that, except just complying with the compact to the end of the compact, 2027. Once upon that time, then they can renegotiate and everybody is fairly into the game. This is about trust, but it is trust from the To'o O'odham to the federal government, to the taxpayers of Arizona, to the governor, and to the other tribes of Arizona. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1410? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2449.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 153, H.R. 2449, a bill to authorize the President to extend the term of the agreement for cooperation between the government of the United States of America and the government of the Republic of Korea concerning civil uses of nuclear energy for a period not to exceed March 19, 2016.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include any extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, over the past 6 decades, the United States and South Korea have built a strong and enduring alliance which is the cornerstone of peace, the cornerstone of security in the Asia-Pacific region. Ever since the dark days of the Korean War, our two nations have stood side by side to meet some of today's most pressing challenges. The alliance between our two countries is a model for global partnership in every field, whether it's in the economic field or political or concerning security. And earlier this year, my good friend, the ranking member, and I led a bipartisan delegation to South Korea to reaffirm our nation's steadfast commitment to the good people of South Korea. It was during this visit that we witnessed the tremendous sacrifice that South Koreans made in order to live in freedom. The ranking member and I stood by the wreckage of the naval ship Chonan, paying our respects to the 46 South Korean sailors who perished as a result of the unprovoked North Korean attack, a poignant reminder of the constant threat that our two nations face. When President Park, Madam Park Geun-hye, the first woman to be elected President of South Korea, addressed a joint session of Congress, she honored the deep sacrifice that Americans have made in protecting her beloved nation. I was pleased to serve on the host committee when she visited the Congress. Madam Park and her delegation were warmly received when in Southern California as part of her official visit to the United States. Today, South Korea is at the forefront of global innovation with the world's 13th largest economy. And as a result of the landmark U.S.-South Korea trade agreement, South Korea is our 7th largest trading partner. One of the most important areas of our close economic cooperation is commerce, and particularly commerce in nuclear energy. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, it is so important that the Congress approve this piece of legislation before us today. South Korea's nuclear energy sector is extensive. It's critically important to its economy. Its 23 operating reactors produce 1/3 of the nation's electricity. In an effort to secure greater energy independence, the government plans to double this figure over the next 2 decades, with 11 more power plants to be completed. Much of South Korea's nuclear infrastructure is of American origin, and U.S. businesses provide millions of dollars worth of spare parts and services every year to that nation. That is one of the reasons expansion of this vital sector will be good for the U.S. economy as well. South Korea also plans to become a major nuclear exporter in the international market. Given the truly global nature of this industry, American suppliers stand to make considerable gains as well. For example, in 2009, a consortium of Korean companies was selected to build 4 nuclear power reactors in the United Arab Emirates, a deal worth $20 billion. Of this total, American companies will earn up to $2 billion for this project alone through sales of equipment and of services. It is estimated that this one project will support 5,000 jobs in 17 states. The ability of American companies to export to South Korea's nuclear power sector rests upon our two countries' 40-year-old nuclear cooperation agreement, which expires on March 19th of 2014. The U.S. and South Korean negotiators are currently negotiating a long-term extension of this agreement. But to prevent an unnecessary interruption that would have a major negative impact on our alliance with South Korea and on U.S. exporters alike, Ranking Member Engel and I introduced this bipartisan legislation to extend the existing agreement for 2 years to March 19th of 2016. The State Department is in support of this legislation. Testifying earlier this year on behalf of an extension, a top State Department official told the House Foreign Affairs Committee that an extension would also ensure there is no lapse in our ongoing civil nuclear cooperation, preserving stability and predictability in our joint commercial activities. This bill is a simple extension of the existing agreement with no modifications or changes. That will allow negotiators time to focus on substance instead of the clock. The Foreign Affairs Committee voted unanimously in favor of the bill, which now has a total of 41 co-sponsors on both sides of the aisle, and I urge my colleagues to vote for this legislation so it can be sent to the Senate and then on to the President for his signature, and thereby ensure that the cooperation between our two countries in this vital area can continue without interruption, and I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in support of H.R. 2249, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I'd like to begin by thanking my good friend, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce, and the ranking member, Eliot Engel, for their work on this bipartisan legislation. The current U.S.-South Korea Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, also known as the 123 Agreement, allows the U.S. and South Korea to work together on peaceful uses of nuclear energy. That agreement is set to expire next year. Because our two countries have not yet completed negotiations for a new agreement, H.R. 2449 allows a 2-year extension of the existing agreement to provide more time for the two sides to come to an agreement. An extension would help ensure that there is no lapse in our ongoing civil nuclear cooperation, preserving stability and predictability in our joint commercial activities. South Korea is a vital economic security partner of the United States, and passing this bill would help ensure that we maintain the strongest possible relationship with our trusted ally. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2449 enjoys a large bipartisan and wide support. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Ross-Leitonen, the Chairman Emeritus of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who currently chairs the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank our gracious chairman for the time. And I rise in full support of H.R. 2449, an important bipartisan bill that will extend the U.S.-South Korea Civilian Nuclear Energy Agreement for another 2 years. South Korea is indeed an important ally of the United States, and our bilateral relationship is a cornerstone of America's national security interests in Asia. By passing this stopgap measure, Mr. Speaker, we will avoid the expiration of the original 40-year agreement and allow the United States and South Korea to continue to negotiate on a renewed agreement in good faith. If we do not pass this bill, the current agreement will expire early next year. This would not only cause damage to the U.S.-South Korea relationship, but it will also harm the United States manufacturers who provide parts and services to South Korea's energy sector, and it will negatively impact the technological safety and non-proliferation efforts of both of our countries in the civilian nuclear energy sector. Mr. Speaker, South Korea has become a major user of domestic nuclear power with the partnership of American technology. Nuclear power provides about 1/3 of all of South Korea's electricity, and South Korea is looking to even further expand that percentage. And they are looking to the United States and American businesses to help them achieve their goals. South Korea's partnership with America for civilian nuclear projects already has resulted in billions of dollars for our economy and has created thousands of jobs. Continued cooperation with South Korea would bring even more revenue to America, create much-needed jobs for Americans, but this can only happen, Mr. Speaker, if our two countries can negotiate a long-term agreement. They cannot negotiate in earnest when they're constantly watching the clock. I would ask the gentleman for 15 seconds.
If I could give 30 additional seconds to the gentlelady.
Thank you so much.
The gentlelady is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
To the chairman and to the speaker. They cannot negotiate this, as I said, when they're constantly watching the clock, which I should have done as well. Passing this bill will give them the much-needed time to focus on the negotiations and finally come to a mutually beneficial agreement. So I urge my colleagues to support this strong, bipartisan, much-needed bill that will help U.S. economy, the U.S. jobs and strengthen the alliance between the United States and our key trading partner in South Korea. And I thank the gentleman for the time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady from Florida yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Continue to reserve. We have no speakers at this
Gentleman
time.
reserves. Gentleman from California.
I'll yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific.
I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as a strong supporter and co-sponsor of H.R. 2449, legislation to extend for 2 additional years the existing U.S.-South Korea civilian nuclear energy agreement. As chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, it's my strong belief that passage of this legislation is in the national interest of the United States, and it's also in the vital interest of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. Earlier this year, we held a hearing in our subcommittee to examine the facts behind the current nuclear energy agreement with South Korea and why it needs to be extended. Simply put, the agreement with South Korea strengthens Americans' non-proliferation priorities. It helps to create American jobs in the energy sector, and it's an important symbol of our long friendship with South Korea. I want to commend my colleague from California, Mr. Royce, the chairman of the full committee, and also the ranking member of the committee from New York, Eliot Engel, for introducing this bipartisan legislation. America's friendship with South Korea is stronger today, I think, than probably at any other moment in our history. Forged on the cold, dark battlefields of the Korean War, this year's 60th anniversary of the U.S.-South Korea alliance marks a significant milestone in our ever-growing relationship. There is no doubt it has indeed become the cornerstone of peace and security in East Asia. In fact, it is the enduring, relevant, and forward-looking qualities of our alliance that makes today's consideration of this bill, H.R. 2449, so important. Today, in South Korea, a once war-torn nation has become a world-class economy and leader in high-tech innovation. Its commitment to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in a region where these ideals are oftentimes hard to come by is a testament to the trust we have in our ally and friend, South Korea. I once again thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for joining, for putting this particular legislation together. I'd like to join them in urging my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York. The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I think we have one final member who wishes to speak on this, and I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is a member of the Foreign Affairs, the Judiciary, and the Oversight Committees.
Gentleman from Georgia for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you yielding the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 2449. I think the merits of which have been spoken of well, and we'll discuss that. But I want to rise and discuss really the relationship with the Republic of Korea. Since the 1950s, the Republic of Korea has been a strong ally of the United States and an economic leader in the Pacific region. South Korea is an example of how the free market brings about an increased quality of life. The Republic of Korea is Asia's 4th largest economy and the world's 12th largest economy. In the 1960s, South Korea was on the par with the levels of poverty seen in Africa. Fast forward to 2004, when South Korea joined the $1 trillion club of world economies, in stark contrast to its neighbor to the north. North Korea is one of the most oppressive regimes in the world. The U.S.-South Korea alliance is one that shows the world the promise of democracy and of free enterprise. Today, we recognize just one partnership between our nations, the civilian nuclear energy program. This agreement maintains a safe, secure nuclear program in a very turbulent international environment. I'm very grateful to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation. Congress needs to continue to show how much it values our nation's relationship with South Korea, and a positive vote on this agreement will be a strong step in that regard. When you look at the area, you see the strong light of freedom in South Korea, tarnished only by the darkness of the tyranny in North Korea. That's why we stand with South Korea. That's why this agreement is important. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
to close. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Let me just again thank the chair and the ranking member for their hard work, and listening to the chair talking about the trip that he and the ranking member, what they observed and the information they brought back to the subcommittee and to the committee is so tremendously important, and it just highlights the importance of our great ally, South Korea. It shows we recently passed a trade agreement with them because we worked together and we were able to create jobs through that trade agreement, not only in South Korea, but here in America. And this is an example of what can be when you're working collectively together and trying to make sure that there's no lapse in our ongoing civil nuclear cooperation. And it shows what we can do collectively to make sure that individuals have power but use nuclear forces for the good of mankind and making sure that there is power in their community. So I am delighted today to join with this in a strong bipartisan manner to support H.R. 2449 and ask all of my colleagues to vote and support H.R. 2449. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to recognize the remarks of Mr. Meeks of New York in solidarity. We're both in complete agreement here, as we've discussed in the past, about just how vital this relationship is with South Korea. It is one that for decades we've stood side by side as South Korea and the United States have tried to promote policies in that region in defense of freedom, to support democracy, to support human rights, and at the same time to support economic growth. And now I think it is just as important that we stand together to extend the U.S.-South Korean civilian nuclear energy agreement. And so I would urge my colleagues all to support this bipartisan legislation. I think it is critical not only to our friend and ally, but I would say without it, without this bill, tens of thousands of American workers would be at a grave disadvantage. This bill extends without modification, again, the existing agreement between the U.S. and South Korea for 2 additional years so that the current negotiations can continue uninterrupted. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 2449? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed.
Mr. Speaker, on that, I would request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 301 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 301, a bill to provide for the establishment of the Special Envoy to promote religious freedom of religious minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would just ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, and that they also might have the ability to include extraneous material on this resolution in the record.
Without objection.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to yield myself such time as I may consume. And I rise in support of this legislation because this legislation provides for a very needed special envoy to promote religious freedom for religious minorities in the Middle East and in South Central Asia. This bill, introduced by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, is substantially identical to one which we brought up last year, tried to get out of both bodies. It was H.R. 440, and this body passed that legislation by more than 400 votes. Sadly, In the 2 years that have elapsed since then, the dangers motivating this bill have only grown more acute. In many areas of the Middle East, the first freedom, as we called it, the freedom of religious liberty, is disregarded, and minority communities are not merely under threat. Those communities are now under attack. From Afghanistan to Iran to Syria to Egypt and elsewhere in these regions, religious minorities have been increasingly subjected to unconscionable, often violent persecution. These alarming trends are occurring in the midst of growing regional instability as brutal regimes and terrorists and insurgents seek to assert control over populations and seek to enforce their ideologies by use of fear, by use of brute force. As the bloody civil war rages in Syria, ancient Christian communities are being forced to flee the lands they have inhabited for centuries in the midst of this bloody civil conflict. In Egypt, Coptic Christians have experienced unspeakable abuses at the hands of radical Muslim groups and have been fleeing their country in droves to escape further violence. I've met with many from the vibrant Coptic Christian community in Southern California. In Iran, more than 500 Baha'is have been arbitrarily arrested since 2005 by the Iranian government. In Pakistan, 80 members of the Muslim Ahmadiyya sect were killed by terrorists in their places of worship in 2010, in addition to consistent incidents of violence and even judicial persecution of Christians there. Many of us are aware of the violations of the rights and the deaths of the Shia minority there as well. For all of these alarming reasons, this legislation is at least as timely as it was 2 years ago, and I commend our colleague, Mr. Wolf from Virginia, for bringing it to our attention, and I'm going to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise in support of this bill and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. This bipartisan legislation creates a special envoy to promote religious freedom of religious minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia. Housed at the State Department, the special envoy would be responsible for monitoring and combating acts of religious intolerance, engaging with foreign governments to address laws that discriminate against religious minorities, and working to ensure that the unique needs of religious minority communities are being addressed. This bill is important because religious minority communities all around the world, particularly in the Near East and South Central Asia, are facing increased attacks and persecution. For example, Egypt's recent governments have failed to prevent, investigate, or prosecute crimes against members of religious minority groups, especially Coptic Christians. Churches have been burned to the ground and numerous Christians murdered. Iraq used to have a significant number of religious minorities. These groups have been subject to escalating violence, persecution, and discrimination for their religious beliefs, and today they comprise only about 3% of Iraq's population. By some estimates, half of Iraq's Christian population has fled since 2003. In Iran, the arrest and harassment of members of religious minorities, including Sunni Muslims and Christians, continues to rise. In one notable case last year, an Iranian-American Christian pastor was imprisoned for threatening Iranian national security. And what was his crime? Helping to set up small churches in people's homes. Iran's minority Baha'i community is particularly harassed, punished, imprisoned, and even killed simply because of their religion. This past August, a Baha'i community leader and Bandar Abbas Aran, Mr. Atola Ravanzi, was found murdered in his car on the outskirts of the city, shot in the back of the head. He has been the subject of threats and pressure from agents of Ministry of Intelligence. And until shortly before his death, he had been receiving menacing phone calls from unidentified persons. There is little doubt that his murder was religiously motivated. Until now, the Iranian government has not begun a formal investigation into his murder or the murder of many other Baha'i that have been killed in recent years. It is past time for the Iranian government to move immediately to seek justice for the cruel deaths of its Baha'i citizens. I wish these were isolated cases, but countless other examples exist, from Afghanistan to India to Saudi Arabia. We indeed are fortunate to live in a country that was founded by religious refugees on principles of tolerance. But it is important that we do everything we can to ensure that religious minorities elsewhere in the world enjoy the freedoms and protections they deserve. The freedoms and protections enjoyed by all Americans. Appointing this special envoy will be an important step in that direction, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I would like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, Chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science, co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, author of this bill, and long a spokesman for religious freedom for those of all creeds.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin by thanking Chairman Royce for swiftly moving the bill and for his comments today, and also thank the Republican leadership for recognizing that this simple but critical legislation is worthy of making a priority by this Congress, even as the other issues it faces at this time. In January 2011, following a spat of attacks against Christians in Iraq and ongoing persecution in Egypt, I convened a Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing focused on the plight of religious minorities in Egypt and Iraq. Among the witnesses was Representative Anna Eshoo, who ultimately became the lead Democrat on this bill for 2 consecutive Congresses. During the hearing, we heard sobering testimony about the challenges facing these communities. A resounding theme emerged: Chaldo-Assyrian Christians and Coptic Christians were being marginalized and targeted for violence. These realities were all the more troubling given the historic roots of the faith communities in these 2 countries. Amazingly, many Iraqi Christians today still speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus. Not only were these communities being threatened in the lands they had inhabited for centuries, their plight was largely unknown and seemingly unimportant within the broader foreign policy apparatus. Notably, at the time of the hearing, the post of the U.S. Ambassador for International Religious Freedom had been vacant for 2 years. While the hearing predated the so-called Arab Spring, without questioning, the dramatic changes in the region have only further jeopardized these communities. I was convinced then and remain convinced today that religious minorities in the Middle East and in key countries in South Central Asia, such as Pakistan, as the chairman mentioned, and Afghanistan, need someone who can be their voice both within the halls of Foggy Bottom and abroad with foreign governments. Last Congress, this legislation overwhelmingly passed the House, only to stall in the Senate in the face of opposition by the State Department, the same State Department which to date has failed to designate any countries of particular concern for egregious religious freedom violations since August of 2011. The administration's opposition is short-sighted and frankly indefensible. As we debate this legislation, Coptic Christians are leaving Egypt in droves. As we debate this legislation, 7 Baha'i leaders languish unjustly in Iranian prison, as does American citizen Saeed Abedini. As we debate this legislation, Ahmadi Muslims, as the chairman said, in Pakistan, are prohibited from voting and their graves are desecrated. As we debate this legislation, Syrian Christians fear they too will be caught in the crossfire like Iraqi Christians, or worse yet, like the Iraqi Jewish community. I am told only a single Jewish person remains in the country today where once a vibrant Jewish community flourished. This legislation is supported by such diverse groups as faith-based organizations, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, United Methodist Church, the Ahmadi Muslim Community, Southern Baptist Convention, and Christians United for Israel, among others, as well as multitude of diaspora organizations which are directly linked with the very people the special envoy will serve. Will a special envoy guarantee these communities' survival and even flourishing? I do not know, but I am certain that to do nothing is not an option. Unless, on this administration and this administration's watch, we witness a Middle East emptied of ancient faith communities, foremost among them the Sunni people. German Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, faced with the tyranny of and horror of Nazism, famously said, quote, "Silence in the face of evil is in itself evil. Not to speak is to speak, not to act is act." I want to thank the chairman again, Mr. Royce, and urge my colleagues to join me in sending an undeniable message to persecuted people of faith the world over, and just as importantly to the forces that oppress them, that America, the shining city on a hill, as envisioned by our founders, will not be silent in the face of evil. Please vote yes on H.R. 301. Thank you, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'm happy to yield 3 minutes to the co-author of this bill, the gentlelady from California, Representative Anna Eshoo.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin by thanking the ranking member. I also want to thank the chairman of the committee, and most especially to my colleague and friend, Congressman Wolf. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 301, a bill that will create a special envoy to promote religious freedom of religious minorities in the Near East and South Asia. This legislation responds, as has been said so eloquently of those that spoke before me, to the urgent needs of Christians and other religious minorities who are really under siege in the Middle East, precisely because they are Christians and because they are minorities. In light of the ongoing events in Syria, this legislation could not be more timely. I commend Representative Frank Wolf, who I've worked closely with as co-chair of the Religious Minorities Caucus, and for his partnership in this effort. Most importantly, I thank him for his conscience. We first introduced this legislation in 2011 after Congressman Wolf chaired a hearing to review the violence and the hardship faced by Middle Eastern religious minorities. I testified that day about the plight of who I am descended from, the Assyrians, the world's oldest Christians, who have and continue to flee Iraq. We agreed to press forward with this legislation to create a special envoy at the State Department, the ambassador level, to elevate this issue for the attention that it deserves. The United States of America needs a high-level official dedicated to religious freedom in the region, committed to addressing the concerns of minority communities. Appropriately, H.R. 31 has attracted solid bipartisan support, with 68 co-sponsors calling for the State Department to elevate religious freedom in the Middle East as a diplomatic priority of our country. Just as Senator John Danforth served our nation as Special Envoy to Sudan, and Senator George Mitchell, Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, religious minorities in the Middle East require and deserve a high-level, authoritative voice to address their situation. The history of violence against Christians in the Middle East must not be allowed to repeat itself, and it is. Notably, Syria's ancient Christian population, which makes up 10% of the country, has been forced to flee their ancestral homeland. Churches, and as noted in today's New York Times in a lengthy article, churches have been and continue to be. I'd like to request another minute, please.
I yield the lady another 2 minutes.
Thank you.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think he said 2.
I said 2 minutes.
Churches have been and continue to be attacked and sacred objects ransacked, and the very lives of those that stand against this being threatened. The Christians of Syria, as well as Iraq, Iran, Israel, and Egypt, are the oldest in the world. Christianity was, from the beginning, a Middle Eastern religion. The Assyrian Christians, the Chaldeans, actually celebrate Mass in Aramaic, which is the language Jesus spoke. For more than 2,000 years, Christians have been a key part of the Middle Eastern community. From the founding of our nation, religious freedom has been a pillar of our democracy, and it remains one of the great hallmarks of our country. I urge all my colleagues to join me in supporting this critical legislation to create a special envoy focused on the freedom and survival of these ancient faith communities, and I thank Representative Wolf most especially for his tireless advocacy. I also thank the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops for supporting this legislation and for writing to every member of the House urging their full support, as well as the honor roll of faith-based organizations who support the legislation. Let us go forward and send a very clear message, not only to the other body, legislative body, but also to people around the world, that we remain the beacon of hope and light, and that we uphold this pillar of religious freedom, not only in our own nation, but in countries around the world where people of faith are under siege. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I'm just going to reserve the right to close, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we'll close as our last witness. Let me thank the authors of this bill, Mr. Wolf and Ms. Eshoo, for your dedication, your focus, and your hard work. It would seem that in the year of our Lord 2013, we would learn religious tolerance by now all over the world. We would have learned that it is the right thing to do to be patient with individuals who might believe different than we do, to allow them their way of life so that they can prosper and grow and pray in their own beliefs. Unfortunately, that's not true. And for all of us, we should be concerned wherever religious tolerance is not adhered to. For I recall in the words, and why it concerns us, Dr. King said once that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so if we allow minorities who believe differently than we do anywhere to think that it is okay and we're not going to use whatever diplomatic or other forms of relationships that we have to try to have religious freedoms, they're mistaken. We must not allow our voices to be silent. We must speak in loud and clear language, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, thank you, and I think, Mr. Speaker, in the spirit that Mr. Meeks articulated there, we Americans who cherish religious liberty and all people of goodwill who value the rights of conscience cannot remain silent in the face of this rising regional intolerance. And I think, as he put it, and as Mr. Wolf and Ms. Anna Eshoo put so eloquently, I think it is time to bring about this special envoy to deploy in the Middle East, and I thank Mr. Wolf for his leadership and certainly urge passage of H.R. 301, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 301 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Gentleman from Virginia. The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S-793. Senate Bill 793 is amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 793, an act to support revitalization and reform of the Organization of American States and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include any extraneous material in, on this measure in the record. So I'll at this time yield myself such time as I may consume, Mr. Speaker, and to explain that this legislation would require the Secretary of State to develop a multi-year strategy to bolster the Organization of American States, OAS as we know it, and to improve the performance and the process for managing the budget and the personnel at the OAS. When it was founded in 1948, it was the sole multilateral body in the Western Hemisphere. As the premier hemispheric organization, the OAS's key institutional documents, its charter, the American Declaration of Rights, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, enshrine values that are the foundation for political systems in the Americas. Since its founding, the OAS has accepted too many mandates from its member states, resulting in a loss of international focus, and in turn has reduced, frankly, the organization's effectiveness. And this bill seeks to push the OAS to refocus on those 2 core principles, promoting democratic governance and institutions and resolving the regional disputes. This push comes as other regional bodies are competing with the OAS for regional influence. There is the Central American System of Integration, the Union of South American Nations, and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which includes Cuba, but excludes both the United States and Canada. Many of these political bodies do not represent our values. Most exclude the U.S. Many are used by governments in the region to undermine the OAS, thus undermining U.S. diplomacy in this hemisphere. In order to maintain the OAS as an influential positive force and to defend U.S. engagement, it is important that the U.S. spearhead an effort to reform the OAS and address its many administrative challenges. And this bill calls on the administration to develop a strategy that helps the OAS focus on its core mission, shed non-essential programs, install a results-based budgeting process, and adopt transparent, competitive personnel practices. Additionally, the bill was strengthened in committee to recognize that it is not politically or financially viable for any OAS member state, including the United States, to pay more than 50% of the institution's assessed fees. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of S-793 as amended and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the OAS remains the premier regional forum for the countries of the Americas to conduct multilateral business, an important aspect of U.S. relations with its neighbors. The bill before us today seeks to support the organization, particularly with respect to democracy promotion and the protection of human rights. The version we are poised to pass today in the House adds an important provision to the bipartisan Senate bill introduced by the Senator from New Jersey, Bob Menendez, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This new provision requires of the State Department to examine ways to ensure that the future of OAS member states pays no more than 50% of the regular budget. Currently, based on legacy fee structure from a different era, the U.S. does pay more than 50%, with a series of distorting results. A modernized OAS would benefit from a more egalitarian fee structure. The provisions ask states to lay out a roadmap to achieve such a fee structure and hopefully opens up the conversation with our fellow member states in the OAS in the spirit of consensus and partnership. I'd like to thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for working truly again, as we have done and seen time and time again on the Foreign Affairs Committee, really working in a bipartisan manner on this bill. And we know that sometimes it's not easy, but they have managed to do it, and I thank them for that, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, I would just like to thank Mr. Meeks, and I'm also going to ask, Mr. Speaker, at this time for unanimous consent to yield to the gentlelady from Florida the balance of my time, and that she be able to control that time.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I thank our esteemed chairman for this privilege to speak about an important bill before us. And I'd like to commend Senator Bob Menendez, my dear friend from New Jersey, for introducing this pivotal bill, an important bipartisan bill to bring desperately needed reforms to this failed organization of American states. I remain deeply disappointed, Mr. Speaker, that the OAS continues to live up to the principles of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The OAS should be, but is not, an important regional body that stands up for democratic principles, that promotes the rule of law, that condemns human rights violations. However, the OAS has strayed, and this bill is a positive step forward to bring it back onto the right path. Throughout the region, Mr. Speaker, we have seen ALBA nations continue to ignore their own constitution and deprive their people of the most basic human rights. Has the OAS spoken out against the illegitimate elections in Venezuela? How about the illegitimate elections in Nicaragua? Or what about the continued human rights abuses against the people of Cuba? Just this past Sunday, Mr. Speaker, more than 30 pro-democracy advocates who were peacefully gathering in Cuba were detained and beaten by agents of the regime for doing nothing. But the OAS remains silent on all of these important topics, and in doing so, it fails to hold accountable the authoritarian regimes that oppress millions in our own hemisphere. That is why real and concrete reforms are needed at the OAS right now. I fully support this legislation because it strengthens our mission at the OAS, and it ensures that U.S. taxpayer dollars are used well and no longer go to waste as they are at the OAS right now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with that, I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
We have no speakers. I'm ready to close or reserved if there's any speakers on the other side. You have any ready to close? With that,
gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. Let me just state again about the hard work that Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, working in a bipartisan manner to get this bill done. It's difficult at times when you have different views on different issues, but I think that when you have individuals working together across the aisle, trying to come up with the appropriate compromise for an organization that is needed to have the strength to protect human rights, to make sure there's democracy. Working together to get them on the right track, as Mr. Royce has indicated, is important. To also have the other body, the Senate, working with us so it's bicameral, is a tremendous effort, I think, on both sides, and trying to make sure that we have an organization in our hemisphere that is doing the right thing. And we've got to do it on a continuous basis, being sturdy, being forceful, but also being bipartisan. And so, as I yield back the balance of my time, let me just finally say that the manner in which this bill has come together is the manner of which I wish many bills could come together on this floor and working with the other body. And I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In closing, I want to thank our esteemed chairman, Mr. Ed Royce of California, our committee's ranking member, Mr. Elliot Engel of New York, for their work on this bipartisan, bicameral effort to take one step, just the first step, at deep OAS reform. We want to thank Senator Bob Menendez, the author of the bill, who has been a longtime supporter and a leader in favor of human rights, the rule of law, and democracy, especially in our hemisphere. All of us in our committee look forward to working with Senator Menendez and all of our members and the other body as well as we move forward to enact this bill and make sure that we have the true, meaningful reforms and endeavor to get the OAS once again focused back on their core mission, which should be and remains promoting democracy and human rights in the Americas, a mission from which it has strayed far too often, including up to today. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentlelady yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 793? Those in favor say aye. As amended. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker?
Gentlelady from Florida.
On that, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3092.
The clerk will report the title of the bill. Does the gentleman seek to pass the bill as amended?
I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3092, a bill to amend the Missing Children's Assistance Act and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, and the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wilson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 3092.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 3092 and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as a father of 3 children, I can't imagine the horror if one of my children were missing or in harm's way. Just like any other parent, the thought is unthinkable and one that I'm thankful to have never experienced. My first exposure to the issues facing at-risk populations, such as those served by programs authorized under law, was as a cadet at West Point, just north of New York City. There was a shelter in New York City for runaway children. It was heartbreaking to hear the stories of these children, many of whom were abused or neglected and had no homes to return to. Oftentimes, children who have run away from their homes are the most in danger of being killed or exploited. Approximately 80% of children reported missing are in fact categorized as endangered runaways. These vulnerable kids deserve help. My bill, H.R. 3092, will reauthorize the Missing Children's Assistance Act at current funding levels. Reauthorizing this critical law will ensure that coordination of state and local law enforcement efforts to identify, locate, and recover missing, abducted, and sexually exploited children continues. We cannot afford to wait. The world around us, while often kind and beautiful, can also be cruel and ugly. But it's through the works of groups like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that resources are available to those in dire need. Chances are that you've seen a hotline come across your TV screen looking to collect information about a missing child, but I have never thought about the infrastructure behind these efforts. This legislation seeks to reauthorize these critical programs and ensure no gap in access for the children, families, and communities in need. Since its founding in 1984, the Center, while partnered with local law enforcement, has helped recover more than 188,000 missing children across the United States. April 9, 2014 marks the 30th anniversary of the Justice Department awarding the first National Clearinghouse grant to the Center. Just 2 months after its creation, in June of 1984, President Reagan celebrated the official opening of the Center at a White House ceremony, praising this model of public-private partnership, which has fulfilled his vision for 3 decades. I applaud the efforts of Chairman Klein, Representative Walberg, and my fellow committee members for understanding the importance of this legislation and helping to move it forward. Urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3092 so we can continue to support these vital programs. I reserve the balance of my time.
Recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I rise in strong support of H.R. 3092, the Missing Children's Assistance Reauthorization Act of 2013. This bill will be named after former Congressman E. Clay Shaw, a defender of children's rights from my state of Florida, who recently passed away. Since its inception in 1984, the Missing Children's Assistance Act has helped identify and recover millions of exploited children across our nation. Now that it's due to expire at the end of this month, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to reauthorize this critical legislation that protects society's most vulnerable citizens, our precious children. We have made progress. We now have the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and we now have the Amber Alert. But we still have so much work to do. There are still too many tragic cases of children being abducted, raped, sexually abused, and murdered. As a parent, grandparent, elementary school teacher, and a school principal, I was deeply shaken when a beautiful 4-year-old girl in the custody of the foster care system went missing in my own community. She was missing for 2 years before anyone even knew it. She has never been found. Rilya Wilson's disappearance exposed many of the shortcomings of the Department of Children and Families in my home state of Florida. One of the most troubling aspects of Rilya's case was the fact that Rilya had been withdrawn from preschool. No one gave the foster parent permission to withdraw her. If she were still in school, there would have been so many eyes watching, teachers, parents, and her peers. If she were still in school, somebody would have known that she was missing. If this bill were in place, Rilya would have been saved by sensible procedures. H.R. 3092 adds common sense coordination and oversight provisions that will facilitate protection of foster youth like Rilya. First, the bill updates the law that provides federal support for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The center, which heads national efforts to locate and return missing children to their families, they help stop kidnapping and sexual exploitation of young people nationwide. They staff 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week call lines to both recover missing children and report child exploitation. Since its inception in 1984, the Center has received 210,162 calls for missing children, or an average of 548 per day, and has responded to over 3.7 million calls overall. Thanks to the Center's call hotline, the vast majority of missing children have been recovered quickly. Second, and specific to Rilya's case, H.R. 3092 requires the National Center to help law enforcement work with child welfare agencies to respond to missing foster children. Foster children continue to go missing at much higher rates than their peers, and their disappearances tend to go unreported for much longer periods of time. Under H.R. 3092, law enforcement agencies must notify the National Center of each report received relating to missing children from foster care. This authorization also requires that federal resources support training and technical assistance of law enforcement to work effectively with public schools to identify and recover missing children. It assists in law enforcement in preventing and recovering missing children with disabilities. H.R. 3092 improves current efforts of the Center to identify, locate, and recover victims of child sex trafficking. It also directs the Center to raise awareness about prevention and educational services for programs that support homeless youth who are at significant and increasing risk of social and sexual exploitation. I'm delighted to see Democrats and Republicans come together to stand up strong for missing and exploited children. I'd like to thank Chairman Klein and his staff for their efforts in working with Ranking Member Miller and his staff. I'd like to thank the nonprofit advocates and the bipartisan Senate staff in developing this legislation to reauthorize the Missing Children's Assistance Act. For me, this is personal. It is about a little girl named Rilya Wilson, a foster child born to a drug-addicted mother. It's about Rilya's legacy and the legacy of so many foster children who suffer. For all of us, there should be a simple and sensible way to honor our children and protect society's most vulnerable citizens. This is a great day in the House of Representatives. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the strong words of support from my friend from Florida. I appreciate that very much. Now I'd like to yield to the chairman of the full committee, the Ed and Workforce Committee. I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, my friend Mr. Klein.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Kentucky for yielding the time and for introducing this important legislation. Mr. Speaker, I rise in very strong support today of H.R. 3092, the E. Clay Shaw, Jr. Missing Children's Assistance Reauthorization Act of 2013. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 3092 will help prevent the abduction and sexual exploitation of children. Since 1984, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has worked with the Department of Justice to build a coordinated national system to aid the recovery of missing children, protect children from sexual exploitation, and promote child safety and crime prevention. Over the last 3 decades, the Center has assisted law enforcement in finding thousands of missing children, and its success rate has grown from 62% in 1990 to 97% today. And through its cyber tip line, the Center has received and referred for investigation more than 2 million reports of crimes against children. This bill will ensure the National Center can continue its work on behalf of our most vulnerable citizens while also taking steps to protect taxpayers through enhanced accountability and oversight. Additionally, the legislation supports greater coordination between law enforcement and states, districts, and schools in the race to recover missing children. Furthermore, the E. Clay Shaw, Jr. Missing Children's Assistance Reauthorization Act includes language from a bill authored by my colleague from Michigan, Mr. Tim Walberg, that will strengthen the Center's work with law enforcement to rescue victims of sex trafficking. Mr. Speaker, this is a good bill. It helps protect and defend America's children and their families. I applaud and thank Mr. Guthrie for his work on this legislation, and I strongly urge my colleagues to lend their support, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida.
Is the gentleman from Kentucky proposed to close?
I am, Mr. Speaker. I'm prepared to close. I have no further speakers. I'm prepared to close.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, as my friend from Florida said, able to work together, House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, for a very important issue. And I just want to thank my colleagues for here speaking to the importance of H.R. 3092, the E. Clay Shaw, Jr. Missing Children's Assistance Reauthorization Act of 2013. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has assisted law enforcement in the recovery of more than 188,389 missing children since it was founded in 1984. As of June 2013, the Center's toll-free 24-hour call center received more than 3.8 million calls. Reauthorizing this law will ensure that the critical coordination of state and local enforcement efforts by the Center on behalf of missing, abducted, and sexually exploited children continues. I'm honored to take the lead on this important legislation and urge my colleagues to support this bill so we can continue these vital programs. Again, thanks for both sides for working together, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3092 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. The chair lays before the House a message.
To the Congress of the United States, pursuant to Section 233E1 of the Social Security Act, as amended by the Social Security Amendments of 1977, the Social Security Act, I transmit herewith an agreement on Social Security between the United States of America and the Slovak Republic, the United States-Slovak Republic Totalization Agreement. The agreement consists of two separate instruments, a principal agreement and an administrative arrangement. The agreement was signed in Bratislava on December 10, 2012. The United States-Slovak Republic Totalization Agreement is similar in objective to the Social Security Totalization Agreements already in force with most European Union countries, Australia, Canada, Chile, Japan, Norway, and the Republic of Korea. Such bilateral agreements provide for limited coordination between the United States and foreign Social Security systems to eliminate dual Social Security coverage and taxation, and to help prevent the lost benefit protection that can occur when workers divide their careers between two countries. The United States-Slovak Republic Totalization Agreement contains all provisions mandated by Section 233 of the Social Security Act and other provisions that I deem appropriate to carry out the purposes of Section 233 pursuant to Section 233(c)(4) of the Social Security Act. I also transmit for the information of the Congress a report prepared by the Social Security Administration explaining the key points of the United States-Slovak Republic Totalization Agreement, along with a paragraph-by-paragraph explanation of the provisions of the principal agreement and administrative arrangement. Annexed to this report is another report required by Section 233(e)(1) of the Social Security Act on the effect of the United States-Slovak Republic Totalization Agreement on income and expenditures of the U.S. Social Security Program and the number of individuals affected by the United States-Slovak Republic Totalization Agreement. Signed, Barack Obama, the White House.
Referred to the Committee on Ways and Means and ordered printed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.
The House is expected back in this evening at 6:30 Eastern for votes and speeches. Later in the week, members will work on a forest management measure and a bill that would revise the food stamp program. Also possible, work on a continuing resolution that would keep the federal government funded past the end of the month. Again, our live coverage of the House will continue at 6:30 Eastern. Here's more about that food stamp program expected to come up on Thursday in the House.